And help me bring back the filmmakers, Michael Rohatyn and Peter Yost, as well as Jim Larocca. And I also would like to call Paul Goldberger, author and architecture critic, and it was at the time the architecture critic for the New York Times, and he has been the architecture critic for the New Yorker for many years. And also John Alschuler. John is not only our chair, beloved chair, but he has worked in urban planning all his most of his career. He helped lead the creation of the High Line and the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and advised Mayor Dinkins, Giuliani, Bloomberg, and De Blasio. He thought of urban development at the Columbia University.
So, are you here?
Yeah, why don't you?
I hear. Okay.
I'm not loving this position.
This is one of the biggest panel we ever had. So I would like to start with with Michael and with the filmmakers. You know, you've worked on this film for 9 years.
Yes.
Why 9? I mean, why it took
Why not
so,
10?
No, no. Why it took so long?
Oh my God. Well, there was COVID, and it's a very difficult topic, and I'm sure we went into it maybe without a lot of forethought. So it took us a while to figure out what we were even trying to say, what part of the story we wanted to focus on. So yeah, it took a long time. We did other things in the meantime, but yeah, it was fundraising was very hard. It's costly. This film, the archive you pay for it by the second. And the music, the pop music, is very costly. So we really worked hard. We had wonderful partners doing that. The Better Angel Society, who you see at the end, I have to shout out. We won an amazing $200,000 Library of Congress award, thanks to them, to help us finish the film. And we have Caroline Dorr, who's our executive producer, who's amazing, who's helped us immensely. So there we go.
Yeah, and just to add to that, just subject matter wise, it's not the kind of thing that people leap at in a conversation to fund, because if you can pull it off, hopefully it works. But if you can, it could be a massive snooze fest. And so we didn't get a lot of traction in the business, as it were. And then we also decided to really triple down on the wonkiness and hopefully come out the other side through the archive. And then we marinated in that archive, which took many years. So it was a silly process. But
the balance between the comedy, the New York grit, the wonkiness. It seems incredibly hard for me to reach. And I was wondering if John, Paul, and Jim, who were there, think that the portrayal of that moment is accurate and it reflects what the spirit of it was, if not every detail.
I think there's a lot, very much so. In fact, and I was about to say a moment ago that it's good you guys started when you did, because you had so much footage of people who are no longer here, actually. And if you'd started it in the last couple of years, at least half those interviews would not have existed. So that's a good reason, a good justification for having taken as long as you did. But yeah, I really do think it did capture that moment. We've all forgotten, because so much has happened, how dirty, how difficult, how almost rambunctious and out of control the public realm of the city was in those years. And yet at the same time, in a weird way, there was also an incredible amount of life and vibrancy there. In some ways more than there is now, despite prosperity. And that paradox, I thought, came through in the film, actually. I mean, it was an incredibly vibrant cultural time, because the city was accessible. Nobody wanted to be there, therefore it was cheap and anybody could be there. And so, in the mid-70s, you could be a not very affluent journalist like me and actually, afford to rent a nice apartment, and you could be a dancer and a poet and a filmmaker, and you could live in New York. Yeah. And that's all gone. So that, all of the fixes that have happened have also come at a price. And I felt that a lot of that did come through in the film.
Is this for? Yeah. When we went to the premiere of the film in the city, Michael began by, and I think it was on here tonight, there's a column of all the interviewees. And Peter Goldmark, who you saw, Steve Berger, the most profane person I've ever met, and I were in attendance, and Judah had been expected but wasn't able to come. And the three of us reacted quite emotionally to the fact that we were the only three people on that list still alive. And so this has, for me, forces me to still try to process that this could have been 50 years ago. I still don't believe it. The job they did with this complicated story is quite amazing. And I sat through it again and even increased my appreciation for the skill of the movie making to take a fiscal story with this much narrative drive and conveying the emotion of the time as well as he did, make it quite amazing. When Michael and I were talking about this, he asked me if I could come up with a few of anecdotes that we went through during that time that perhaps have not ever been discussed. And there's quite a few, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but the Shanker part of the story had a little bit of a subtext, and that is that when Governor Carey ran, he, for the first time, had essentially a running mate thrust upon him by the events of the day, and it was an upstate state senator, Marianne Krupsack. And to say the governor and she never got along is an understatement. And during the many, many meetings on 55th Street, the meetings downtown and so forth, it was impossible to say no to the lieutenant governor, but there was also a problem with it in that a lot of confidentiality was needed in those meetings, and the lieutenant governor didn't see it that way. And at a critical time, when all of the labor leader pieces were in place, except for Al Shanker, Al Shanker did not know that he had that much leverage until Marianne walked down to the end of the hall at 55th Street and told the press that it's almost done, Al Shanker's the holdout. And that empowered him to bargain very hard. And so when you see him finally come around, I can tell you that the state and city paid a price for that, to get that agreement in place. The other anecdote that I would bring around, a little bit of a humor in it, after the meeting, the first meeting in the White House that you see, it was the first thing I was directly involved in after I came aboard. And when we came out of the White House, we were getting in the cars, and I learned something about the governor the family knows, but I learned is you could often read the governor without him saying anything. He had a way of giving you a look that conveyed, and the look he gave me after that was like, well, that went well, you know. And so I don't remember if he asked me or not, and I said, I don't think we should ever do this again. You were here for 14 years. You were the best liked people on Capitol Hill. You and Jerry Ford played golf together. You hung out together. You enjoyed each other. You sometimes played cards on Monday night at Maggie Hunter's, a big card game and everything else. These meetings, and we're going to have to do this body by body in the Senate, in the House, the committees particularly, you should just do it. Not with an entourage. I think we had 20 people down from the state for that White House meeting. So it became political theater. Ford was uncomfortable. The outcome was not good for anybody. And we never did that again. And for the next couple of months, we used this enormous asset that Governor Carey had having been 14 years on the Hill, widely respected. He also had a very strong relationship with Governor Rockefeller because he was the New York member of Ways and Means. And so we made round after round after round, but it was almost again one-on-one. And I think that's how the Washington end of it got delivered on the Hill, because most people from the rest of the country really didn't like New York. And when the delegation would go to meetings with other delegations, all they'd hear about is welfare queens and what are you people in New York, and you give free so none of that was working. But the governor, one-on-one with all his old colleagues, was a key part of all of that. And a final part of that is one night we were set up to see Nelson Rockefeller at home. He had a house in Foxhall in Washington. He never lived in the house that they gave the vice president those days. And Governor Rockefeller wanted, then vice president, wanted Mayor Wagner to be part of the meeting. And so I had arranged all that. And Mayor Wagner didn't really want to come down. We had to put it all together, flew him down on the plane. We went out to the house on Foxhall Road, a super secret meeting because Rockefeller had dodged responsibility, as you saw at the White House meeting. And the promise I had to make to Mayor Wagner and his wife was that I'd get him back in time for dinner in New York. We came out of the meeting. It was a very successful meeting. Kerry and Rockefeller talked through the realities of where everything was. And I had somebody standing by with a car to go back out to Butler Aviation to get Mayor Wagner on the airplane and back to New York because we had promised that for Phyllis. And when they got out there, my guy and the car, the lieutenant governor had taken the airplane. And so we stranded the mayor. I promised we would get him home on time. And something with this level of intensity had those kind of events sort of built in right below the surface many, many times.
Paul talked a lot about, I think correctly, the vibrancy and energy and authenticity of New York. And one of the really great things you did was capture that, not by the artists living in Soho or not by young journalists, but by the voice of the cops, the voice of the firefighters, the voice of the teachers. And that was the greatness of New York. People forget that, in 1960, when this all begins, New York makes half the steel that's created in America. It brews 2/3 of the beer people drink. It makes 95% of the garments that women in America make. Wall Street was, important to the global capitalism. Didn't matter that much to the economy of the city of New York. We were a working industrial city. And the unions and the spirit and the energy of New York came out of that. And we get into the fiscal crisis because that New York disappears. And the jobs move away. They can't afford, they can't live here. And they leave. And so the Lindsay administration, which I think the one thing I would is the Lindsay administration gets off really light.
Yeah.
A
single
really
shot.
light.
Other than a little cameo of John Lindsay there,
one,
it's
right?
not even mentioned. In fact, you're right, and they in fact have
Lindsay
a lot
knew-
more responsibility than
Lindsay and his financial team knew exactly what was going on. They knew the city was about to go bankrupt. They knew they were handing a beam, a absolute unsolvable crisis that they in fact made worse in their last 2 years. And so they had made a big gamble, essentially the same gamble Mike Bloomberg made after 9/11. Mike's worked. The gamble Lindsay made was you spend money, you invest in the city, you make it fun, you make it interesting, and the tax base will come back. Well, he was right, just 30 years too early.
Well, John, I think it's because in both cases, though, for all the power and might the city has or potentially has, it's also very subject to larger global economic and financial trends. And they were not so good in the 70s, and they were different in Mike Bloomberg's time.
Exactly. I mean, Lindsay makes the bet Mayor Bloomberg makes.
Right.
He makes it in 1965. It was impossible. Bloomberg, 9/11 happens. Bloomberg comes in and he does a Lindsay. He passes the largest single tax increase in the city's history because he says for New York City to recover, for us to get back from this horrendous death, from this loss of course, we've got to make New York City a great place to live. So he spends a fortune. Now, this is the beginning of the 20th century. Finance is
21st century, right?
Thank you. So we make money, and Mike's bet works. Lindsay's bet, same bet, 30 years too early, tragically wrong, and Lindsay comes off in this. It's Abe Beam didn't create this problem. This problem got created by a completely different generation and a completely different culture.
So, if I may, we certainly thought about Lindsay. We have a whole section. We didn't want to keep you here that long, so we cut some of the movie down. We felt two things. One was that Lindsay had already had his own movie, and this is a pretty well-known story. The other, though, we thought it was kind of a more interesting take, which was Lindsay could not have spent all that money without Rockefeller.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought it was kind of interesting if you go upstream, you find Rockefeller, or downstream, I don't know which way you would go there, and that you find a Republican who is a liberal, big spending Republican. The beginning of the bankruptcies in New York started at the state level with the Urban Development Corporation, and that was a Rockefeller creature. So that's all I have to say.
No, that's absolutely right. But also, this was all against
Maybe not right.
backdrop of the end of the manufacturing economy that John was just referring to, and the rise of the financial services economy,
and the overwhelming power of the state of New York. I mean, the word city does not appear in the United States Constitution. It doesn't exist. The Constitution is very simple. It says these powers are delegated to the federal government. All other powers are delegated to the state. And so the state makes a decision, its sole discretion, what power to give to the city. So ultimately, I think the great hero of this really is Hugh Carey and the incredible leadership he provides in getting the state, which is the only thing that can empower the city to raise the revenue. The city can't solve its problems. The city doesn't have the power. Legally, it can't raise taxes. And municipal bankruptcies are very different than a private company. Private company starts losing revenue. Well, it can't pass a law that says I want more customers. It can't pass a law that says I'm going to charge my customers, 30% more to get me out of bankruptcy. Well, government can pass a law and solve its bankruptcy. If it has the breadth and width and strength of the state of New York. So the state steps in, and the city, without the state, and ultimately without the feds that made money out of the deal, can't go anywhere.
It is very clear that the math didn't work. Yet there is something electrifying in the film about the social values that it put forward. And I was wondering for Michael and for Peter, how important was that component?
Well, I'll speak for myself, and then you could straighten it out. Yes, we'll speak for the royal we. I think it was vital, and I think it was a time where it was a generation where people were first, second generation immigrants in many cases who were running the city. And I think there was a belief, there still is to some degree, but it's pretty truncated at the moment, I think, in certain quarters. There was a belief that it was a place of opportunity, that you could come, as the one guy says, only on his good looks as in the sanitation department and work his way up and have an amazing career. And he was a real leader and an incredible person who's carved out an incredible life. And that was possible then. And I think that was the ethos of the place. It's what the city represented in the past. And I think there's a lot of time spent now among a certain class of people talking about their kitchen renovations and not so much about the inequity that continues to exist in the city and the opportunity that does or doesn't exist for other folks. And so I think for us, it was key. It's complicated because in many ways the city's in a better place, and in other ways
Right.
it's not.
Right.
And that was the complexity that we wanted to try to hold and put before people.
Now, I think you did. I think it comes through. The city. Well, first, I mean, the city of opportunity really did, in fact, exist. I think it was not just a fantasy of a couple of speakers or of you as filmmakers. I mean, it was, in fact, the kind of rock on which New York was built, and it has not, in fact, functioned that way. I think what ties together all of the different phenomena that we deal with today, I think, is a loss in the belief in the commonweal. And New York was founded on the belief in the commonweal.
A friend who saw the film the other day, I mean, there's certain, at the risk of stating the obvious, parallels with what's going on in the recent weeks and months, where a friend said, in his opinion, that what's happening right now is that there is this was a real crisis. And there was a real problem when people came together and fixed it the way they did, albeit in a inevitably flawed way. But what's happening right now is arguably a fake crisis. It's being used to bludgeon the government into submission, and there it was an attempt to reform it.
Yes.
A lot of what's magical about the film, I think, is just how prescient it is about our own time. And you look at this debate about bailing out, a city of 8 million people, and you realize since that time and our time, we've bailed out major investment banks. We've bailed out commercial banks. We've bailed out 3 major auto companies. We've bailed out Fannie and Freddie. I mean, we've made billions of dollars of profit for private investors with guarantees for which none of this debate occurred, right? And so the singling out of New York for the notion that the federal government should not create the moral hazard of guaranteeing irresponsible decisions was cast aside when we were dealing with international capital, not when we were dealing with 8 million people and their fate and their government.
I think that's a very, very important point. And in fact, I would even take it a little bit further and say, if there's any critique I might have of any element of the film, it's that the idea of New York as critical to the United States and as meaning more than the lives and well-being of the 8 million people who live there, but actually being deeply connected to the well-being and identity of the entire country, doesn't really get there except in that one quote from the G6 meeting in Paris where, the German chancellor says something to that effect. And in fact, that was a key point that wasn't really talked about enough in those days either, actually. And maybe that part of the problem was that those in New York who were arguing the case with the federal government didn't themselves make that point.
And also there's just an enormous amount of fiscal illiteracy here. I mean, at this time when people are saying we don't want to give these people a handout, New York is sending hundreds of millions of dollars more to the federal government than it's getting back.
Right.
And that number only gets worse. So in a very simple mechanical level, all we were saying is, excuse me, just lend us some of the money back. We're sending you off our backs.
But that argument, which is a valid argument, wasn't selling with anybody. And Senator Moynihan, when he got to the Senate, started publishing every year a report called Qui Bene, a little Latin from the professor, and it was about who benefits. And his thesis was that in politics, always know where the other fellow's interests lie. And Governor Carey used to say that to the people who hold interests, all interests, their interests are special. And we came to a point right around the time of that summit meeting where what we were not doing in trying to win over the federal government and put some footing under the president was every city in the country, every state in the country had a stake in this outcome. And Felix sent me to see some really lively organization called the Municipal Finance Officers Association in Washington, and to commission a 50-city analysis of what a bankruptcy in New York City would cost them in terms of impacts on public finance, on tax-exempt financing. And we went from going to these meetings with other delegations and senators and everybody else, telling us what was wrong with New York City, and we trying to argue for the validity of what we did and the kind of city we were, which was, well, here's your stake in it. Chicago is a perfect example. We into one night about 10 or 11 o'clock, Senator William Proxmire's committee, Senate Banking, Adlai Stevenson was hostile to any rescue for New York City, and it made no sense. I noticed that the guy sitting behind him wasn't a regular staffer that I knew, but a senior vice president of the Chicago, Illinois Bank. And we, armed with this thing from the municipal officers, we could tell you city by city what the impact would be on a point, a half a point, and change in the value of your financings that were coming up. So we didn't have to defend ourselves anymore. We were able to say, your stake in this, your special interest, if you will, is that this is going to cost you money. If we can't get to market in New York, you're going to have trouble getting to market everywhere. This will poison that market in ways that had never happened, where a state or a city of any consequence was in this much trouble. And I think the turning point was, and I think President Ford found his way to listening to people besides Rumsfeld and Cheney, was that that's right. The stake here was not just in New York. New York was the trigger that could do harm all over the country. And I think that's when it turned around.
Can I just say one little thing? Because as filmmakers, one of the dilemmas for us was that no one knew what would happen. So we have a film that's a disaster film, but we don't have really a clear sense of what the stakes are, which is obviously very difficult. A friend of mine said the other day that he thought that the municipal bonds, that whole thing was kind of like the MacGuffin. Like you kind of get the municipal bonds, that's sort of there's some business, and you get out of the way because the real story is this is going badly, it's going down, and there's suspense. And really what we wound up being sort of more drawn to was the unknown of what happens if, the fact that no one knew. That's all we could really do. I love that there were these like careful analyses, but really everyone we asked, we were like, well, what would happen? Everyone gave a different answer. The best was Dick Ravitch saying, well, they could have sold Central Park. So, which we sort of, we have that in the sizzle reel, but in any case, that's so small.
I would like to open it.
Sold it for real estate development, or sold it to someone? Okay.
Awesome.
If you have any questions,
Mining.
I'm sure there are some. There is one right here.
I just want to make a comment. Obviously, as the family members, we're so grateful for what you've done here. It's really unbelievable. I think beyond our imagination. But I just wanted to share with you, I noticed the name of the film company, Pangloss. And Panglossian was a term that my father always used in referring to himself and his world outlook. He was a Panglossian.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've long had that name, the best of all possible worlds, because everything always goes wrong, but can you see and make something of it? And there's an opportunity in that.
There's a question here. No, hold on one second. Thank you.
I didn't know what the Federal Reserve was missing from the film. I mean, we know from 2008 that the Federal Reserve was aware of banking crises, and this was a national crisis. And so it wasn't even a need for the city to sell to the banks that there is a national crisis. The Federal Reserve either knows that or should know that. It was very obvious in 2008. So I don't know what was going on back then.
I can tell you only about one meeting that I was part of where we went to the Federal Reserve. And it was the governor. Felix was not with us that day, but a couple of the other bankers. And the story that came out of that for me, the editor of Newsday was then the Washington bureau chief. And after we picked up the governor at the air terminal, we went to the Fed. I couldn't find it. I had the wrong address. So the story became we were late, and Newsday decided this new kid doesn't know what he's doing. Anyway, at that meeting, it was absolutely clear that the Fed did not see it as something they should be noticeably or directly involved in. And I wasn't smart enough at the time to know the dynamics of all that, but they were clearly looking for some distance. They didn't want this cotillion of New York politicians to draw them into this thing, at least at that time.
Had they ever been
exactly.
involved in municipal finance or not?
But the Fed
I don't
didn't
know.
have to be involved in municipal finance. I mean, the Fed knew exactly what was going on. Ravitch and Volcker were very close friends. And it's inconceivable to me that Ravitch and Volcker are not talking, all the time. And the Fed doesn't have to lend in New York. All the Fed has to do is to backstop the banks. The Fed backstops the banks, which is part of the Fed's job, which is essentially what Governor Kerry got the state of New York to do, which is basically to backstop the city. So the crisis comes because the banks look and they go, how do I get paid? Well, they want a guarantee. That's what they got from the Feds. They could have gotten that they ultimately got it from the state and the federal government. The Fed could have stepped in. The Fed did that, big time in 2010, 2011. So it wasn't a power question. I think, it was
I think,
a political
John,
decision.
that itself is an interesting point to get back to the question, because in effect, what we're saying is an awful lot of trouble could have been avoided if the Fed had simply taken that simple step much earlier on, right? I mean, the world could have been a lot simpler, and we would not have been at the brink in quite the same way.
And as I think the film makes beautifully and brilliantly clear, that which was a financial problem was underlying just an expression of what was fundamentally a political problem. And once the political problem got solved with the leadership of the governor, then the financial problem could get solved. Right. Felix Rohatyn was an amazingly brilliant and persistent and phenomenal negotiator. Without the power of the state behind him, he had nothing.
Right.
And so it was the partnership between the governor and Felix Rohatyn that ultimately solved it. But it was a political problem that had to get solved politically.
It's interesting to think about how many of the people who played key roles there have no equal in public life today. I mean, first, as you said earlier, centrist Republicans don't exist. Also, in the world of investment banking, there are very few with Felix Rohatyn's broad sensibilities, sense of civic commitment and obligation.
And belief in government.
And belief in government as opposed to belief in government as an evil. And belief actually really in the kind of liberal democracy of opportunity that New York represented. He just understood that had to be balanced with other things or the whole thing would collapse. But he didn't not believe in it. He merely understood that it had to be managed better.
I think that's very true, Paul, but I think it's a broader problem in that, in 1973, the major corporations of the city can't survive without the city of New York.
Right.
And these people live in New York. Their businesses in New York. Their employees work in New York. If you pick your global institution, you're as worried about what's going on in Singapore and Tokyo and Frankfurt as you are in New York City. And you're a global citizen. And the financial leadership of the city right now has just such an attenuated sense of the needs and survival of the city. So the leadership that we got back then was pre-globalization. Yeah. It was leadership before the corporate structure of America became global. And if we had that crisis today, it's hard to imagine, frankly, who would have the interests and the passion and the commitment to step up and put the power of Citibank, the power of Lazard, the power of the banking industry. Because, ultimately, they too were part of the solution. Too late, too greedy, too ugly, but they ultimately were there.
And who would have the authority to convene them even in the
Exactly.
same way?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think there was a question right there.
I have a question. What made New York unique in this era that we didn't have the same thing happening in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia? Why was it New York? Well, Detroit we did, but there was a lot of other eastern cities.
Yeah, a bit later, but it was the same. Yeah.
I think it's a toxic combination of two things present in every other city. One is a phenomenally deeply committed liberal political leadership in the best sense of the term, free education, free healthcare, and the ability to cheat and cook the books and mislead in order to accomplish those objectives, not because they were bad people. Many of them, many of them are my friends and mentors. They made the Mike Bloomberg gamble. They bet that if they cooked the books, they found the money, the city would recover, and the money they fooled themselves.
Do you see it? I'm not sure in the comparative sense. Is it that the social gamble in New York was higher? I mean, everything in New York is bigger and higher, right. But that they were more committed than other cities to that, and so they were just more exposed? Or did versions of this, what was happening? Why was New York so particular? Because you would imagine that there was bad bookkeeping and dysfunction in every
it's
city.
Two sides. It's yes, I think there is, in the Lindsay years, much more passion about the shining vision and future of New York. And, the greatness of John Lindsay is his love of New York, his belief in it, his belief in the people of the city. And on the other side, the rate of industrial collapse is just greater. So it's this terrible combination of much more rapid industrial collapse. I mean, the garment industry was, the greatest single employer in the city. It disappears. The steel industry disappears. And so the rapidity of the decline of the tax base, when married to the strength of the vision of the future, creates a crisis of unparalleled dimension.
Yeah, I think there was a simple, complete failure to understand that they were kind of two trend lines that were going in opposite directions, and nobody was seeing either one of them, really, I think. Certainly not understanding the industrial collapse, and then either not understanding or choosing to ignore the city's own internal financial.
That's why you're
I want to make an argument
well
here.
said.
I want to make an argument here that what was happening in New York was not unique, and what's happening in Washington right now has many of the trappings of what happened in New York. Printing money, not looking far enough in the future to deal with the consequences of what you're doing today. Incompetency, every day there's a hearing on the Hill right now, and a secretary in the cabinet the other day confused a $1.2 billion with a $1 trillion cost. And so many of the sins that the city was committing are being committed right now in plain sight.
And not for the let's say noble goal.
Not for the
however naive it may have been, not for the noble aspirations either of the city.
And you're so right. And we see exactly the same thing happening. I mean, the price of in order to attract capital into the U.S. Treasury market, rates are going up because people have begun to lose faith in our ability to pay. So the early warning signs that New York saw are already showing up in the international capital markets around the U.S. debt. Exactly the same thing.
There's a question there.
I noticed, and it seems, first of all, I want to say I love the film, and I hope it's going to have wider distribution. But in addition to that, I wondered what you see as the role of the Financial Control Board in providing a sort of sense of of confidence to a lot of the necessary constituents. It wasn't really mentioned or dealt with in the film.
Well, we had so many things mentioned in the film that it was, we had to leave a few things out. This may not be a direct answer to what you were saying, but I hope it gets us somewhere. And I think we now say we're like an old married couple. Or I guess a really older
Deeply
married couple, you just say
problematic
I,
on
and
many
you don't say
levels.
we anymore. Okay, so what I feel like was the thing that was the hardest to turn and the most sort of mysterious was when the capital markets got spooked. And that was, New York was addicted to short-term borrowing. Interest rates were climbing and climbing. And, that was not the case in Bloomberg's day, right? So if you're trying to borrow and build and your borrowing costs are like that, now you can't get suddenly this thing, and we've seen this in other episodes, the capital markets are supposed to have this amazing, magical understanding of the underlying risk of everything. And when it fails, they just leave. And when that happened and the city couldn't borrow, that just cascaded. And I do think that the right now, the balanced budget in New York City is like that is what we will never have happen again, is at least that feeling of like, we're just not going to lend anymore because we have no idea what's going on there. And of course the banks should have known. They certainly made a lot of money. And I hope everybody caught that William Simon was the risk advisor to Beam and had been the head of the municipal bonds desk at Salomon Brothers. So
went on to kind of invent private equity, right?
Well, yeah.
And then, right.
And a good citizen of this part of New York.
So illuminating, and the antipathy to New York today from Washington really resonated to me, and we could talk about that forever. I just have a very simple question. Where will this film be seen, and how will this film be seen now after? What distribution?
Well, it's been seen so far. It's an entirely independent process, masochistic one at that. That's taken the better part of a decade. And we showed it at one festival in New York City, the closing night of Doc NYC, and somebody there who worked for IFC, which is in the West Village, said, "Oh, we'll give it a shot. We'll try it." And it's been there now for 7 weeks nonstop with many sellouts and this sort of thing. So it's still been running, which for a documentary like this is highly unusual and very welcome and reassuring. And then it's been in about 10 or 15 theaters around the country so far, still going elsewhere. And then we're going to be streaming come summer. But
we're not sure.
Yeah, but we're still not quite sure.
Yeah.
And so it remains
It's not a good time for documentary film.
Yeah, and it remains maybe, we've both worked in different forms of film over the years, and it's just a quirky, and I say, there's a misalignment sometimes, in my opinion, between the market and maybe the merit over time and the endurance of something. And I think we both feel good about it, and the response we've been getting in person from people is tremendous. And so I think
maybe
it'll find its
anyone
way.
in this room,
if anyone wants to buy it,
we'll be in
let
a
us
lot.
know.
But I mean, you've all felt it, that there is a relationship to the president, though clearly, the context is completely different and certain things are not possible. But one thing that I was wondering is looking at it, and as the idealist in me, is where would there an alignment like this? Because this is not just different leadership, it's an alignment between the people of New York, the union, the banks, and it's a forced alignment. I mean, they didn't volunteer, but it all gelled together. And do you see any situation right now where a similar, if not same alignment could trigger?
I mean, I don't really. I feel like this was a moment where it was kind of the high point of labor and the high point of a certain kind of statesmanship of Hugh Carey. It was very, a unique circumstance and a moment where self-interest and public interest suddenly, kind of merged. The unions had the money that, the city needed. That the beauty of that, I don't see that happening. I might be,
No, I think you're right. I mean, and I would add to that, as I said earlier, the sense from the private sector of someone like Felix Rohatyn having that sense of civic responsibility and believing in the commonweal, as opposed to just, me, the bigger my slice of the pie is all I care about.
And I can actually just quickly, from a filmmaking standpoint, with half a foot that in the objective realm, unlike Michael, who had obvious familial ties, but coming at this and to show how we portrayed Felix, it's interesting. He's the opposite of a grandstander. Right. We went through hundreds of hours of film, and we couldn't find a place where you even have a Schenker, love or hate Schenker, or somewhere in the middle. He's on camera acting out, and it's gripping. And Felix was extremely charismatic and witty, but it happened behind the scenes. It happened quietly. It was in relationships, and it wasn't ultimately. I'm sure he had an ego, but it wasn't for the cameras and about him.
He was an unbloviator.
But to say something positive about what was a terrifying event is, the bankruptcy could never happen again because of the laws that created Big Mac, the requirements on the city, the disclosure issues now are just fundamentally different. But what the fiscal crisis did, for which we have all been an enormous benefit, is it created a template of public and private collaboration that a lot of what made New York come alive from this near-death experience it's what saved Central Park. It was a collaboration of the government and the private sector. And people like Ravitch, people who we saw in this film, took the lesson of bringing union, government, and private capital together and did things that reformed Times Square, did things that reformed Lower Manhattan, and in ways that no other city in America has done. And I think a lot of the extraordinary creativity of New York from 1975 into this century comes out of lessons that were just burned into people's brains and hearts that came out of the fiscal crisis. And so it wasn't a one-off. It wasn't just Hugh Carey and Felix Rohatyn. That mindset gets translated into hundreds of people working together. And the model of the heroism of this film fuels so much of in New York for generations, for which we have to be very grateful for the people who invented the model, Felix Rohatyn, Hugh Carey, and the unions.
I'd say one little thing, which is when Peter and I started working on this, and we started with the interviews, and not knowing, as I said, quite where we were going, and we fell in love with the characters, the wonderful people we were talking to. And I told Peter, we were a small crew, Peter, me, and a cameraman. I said, we're going to ask every one of these guys, what was the worst thing that happened to you in 1975? And they're all going to have a good story. It's going to be like, I got mugged, I got whatever. And then we're going to hit them with, but if you could go back there today, would you go? And they're all going to say yes, and none of them did. Because why would I want to go back to that? And to what you're saying, Paul, I, as a 12-year-old, and as a, if you wanted to be something sort of, maybe nothing, maybe you just wanted to experiment with who you wanted to be, it was a great time. But if you were in that situation and you were tasked with trying to get out of it, it was a kind of an awful time. And anyway, that was a lesson for me. I quite hadn't expected it.
That's right. Yeah.
There was one question. Phil, did you have a question?
I think Peter somewhat answered. I was just going to ask Michael the particular challenge of making a documentary of which your own father is such a predominant figure, how you dealt with that.
Right from the beginning, we were that was strict, that I didn't want in any way for it to look like a puff piece. Many of the interviews, I wasn't Peter did the interview first, and then I'd get irritated and be like, I have to ask a couple of questions. But we tried to even not tell people who was asking. And then we were super careful in the cut to it was really a matter of anxiety for me to make sure that I honored him, and many, I think we may have overdone it a little bit sometimes, but I think his character and his personality come through. And but yeah, it was very hard to do. And yeah, thanks. I love Phil.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I just wanted to say, I actually think there's. Hi. With respect to Felix, I think there's part of it that's actually unsaid. And it was actually an incredible amount of what I would call innovation. Because what happened was they came up with a model. In the corporate world, whenever you have something like this, somebody takes a huge haircut, a shareholder, a bondholder, or someone. And because of his kind of sense of civic duty, actually came up with a model where you could work out over time by collecting future tax revenues, dedicating them to a fiscally responsible group, and have that group manage the city. Or it's been used many other public-private, Detroit, other places. And I really think the sort of innovation of how do you do this without a huge haircut? Now, obviously, there was a cost to the citizens of the city of New York, but there wasn't a haircut that could kind of prevent this to be used elsewhere. And I think that innovation is something that you all should be proud of because of what he did.
Thank you.
And with this one, we have to close because we have another screening. Thank you so much for
Thank you, Giulia.
Michael,
Thank
Peter, John, Paul,
for
Jim.
coming.
Thank you for being here.